Let's talk now about routing. Up to now, we've only been sending back the same response when the server receives a request, no matter what the URL is, no matter what / anything is. Big word alert. Routing. This means mapping HTTP requests to content. And this can be whether there's actual files that live on the server or not. In other words, I might have a URL that says /someimagename.jpg. And so I receive that request. And maybe that image doesn't live on the server. Maybe it's in a database. But I can say, well, I'm just responding to the request. So when I see the request for that URL, I will give it this response. And maybe I'll go to the database to get the image because it's not on the file server itself. Or I may have things sitting actually on the server as a file, and then I can just connect to it with a stream and stream it back. Or maybe I have to do some manipulation of data or processing a template or whatever. But I'm saying the route will map the request to content. Because realize when you request a file on the internet to download it, you're not directly connecting to the file, you're connecting to the server and saying, please give me this. And it may be that the server is doing various things to give you that content. It might be pulling a file off the server, it might be getting data from a database, it might be building HTML on the fly. You don't really know. And so when we're building routing, we're just saying when someone gives me a request for something specific, I'll give content back to them. I'll stream the content back to them. And how I deal with the content internally, well, that's up to me. So let's look at routing at a very simple level. So we're back here to our JSON code where we serialized it to JSON, the JavaScript object, and that's it. That was our HTTP response. Now we want to respond more properly to different URLs that come in the HTTP request. Because right now, and this may surprise you, every URL we send to Node will give me back the same data. So if I run this, and then I go to my URL, localhost :1337, there's data. And let's say I go to /more data. I still get that back. If I go to /somefile.html, still that data. If I go to /what_is going/on/here/what.txt, same data. All right, so why? Well, this has to do with our mental model about what's happening when we make a request from the browser. You may be thinking, well, that file doesn't exist. That's right. But again, all that's happening, all the browser is doing is sending an HTTP request. And the URL is one of those pieces of data in that request. And it's up to the server as to what to do with it. And so in our case, with our code so far, we aren't even looking at the URL. We're just saying, here's the response. Here's the HTTP response for a request, for any request, because that's all we're doing. So every HTTP request we make, no matter what URL we put in, that's the response we're giving. So what we want to do is look at the URL passed in the request and choose to give different content based on those different URLs. Does that make sense? All right. So again, we want to have our mental model clear about how the browser and the server, how the client and the server communicate. It's just through these requests and responses. So I've been given a request, let's say for a URL. So I can access it. Node gives me access in the request object with .url. And I could say, and I'll use triple equals, which is good practice in JavaScript, instead of double equals, which will try to convert one side of the equals to the same type as the other side. It could be dangerous, so we'll use triple equals, which won't try to convert any values to different types of values. And let's say /API. If that's the URL, then we'll give back the JSON. All right. And let's say that if the request is just a slash, which was just the core basic URL, I'll instead do what I did with the file. So I'll say fs.create read stream dir_name plus index.htm gives me back a stream, and I'll pipe that to the response instead. All right, so when I get an HTTP request, now I'll look at the URL and make decisions on what content to give back in my HTTP response. All right, let's try this. I'll stop Node. Don't forget to do that. Restart it. We'll see how to avoid that later. And I'll refresh. And uh-oh, something didn't work. You know, we haven't actually seen any errors yet through this course, so this was a good opportunity to see one. This kind of thing can happen to you. You go and refresh and it's broken. So you can go to the console, because Node will send the events there, send the error events, the errors themselves. And so I can see that I have an unhandled error. And it says no such file or directory, node.js index.htm. So do you see what we did wrong in our code? Going to get the index.htm file? Right, I forgot a slash. So it combined the directory name with that file name and couldn't find that. All right, so let's rerun it because the Node process stopped when the error happened. Refresh, and there it is. All right, so the HTTP request came in. The URL was just slash, meaning there was nothing at the end of this. It was just a slash. And I returned the contents. I streamed the contents of the HTML file. And hopefully you did this too. You should be doing this as well yourself in order to learn. Now, the other thing we did was look at a different URL possibility. So API/API will give me instead JSON. So if I go to /API, the HTTP request, the URL will be that /API, and I have run code to deal with that. See that? And if I do something different, there is no code to handle it. So it will try to get it from the server, and eventually the browser will fail, because Node will just sit there and say, I don't know what to do with that. And I didn't actually handle it very well. So we need some robustness to handle the cases when we're requesting a URL that doesn't exist. I'll cancel this, stop this. So I could just say, if I go back here, that if something doesn't exist, I'll just put at the end here, outside my if statements, write head 404, let's say. And I'll just end it with nothing, just for fun. Let's try this. I request a URL that doesn't exist, and boom, I get nothing. And if I actually were to look at the network, I see that it's a 404 error, and that means it couldn't be found. That's standard for HTTP. So there, I've done a little bit better. I've handled that better. And I have specific URLs that return specific content. And one other thing that we need to do in order to make this robust, this actually won't completely work right now, because even though we might stream the contents out as a result, it will still run these other lines of code, including this 404 at the end. So we'll always end up with 404s. So I can just put else if, or I could use a switch statement or some other logical flow, and then a last else here to make sure that these don't all run, but they only run under each specific circumstance. There. So now I'm responding properly to each of these scenarios. This is the idea of routing. But this could get really cumbersome, don't you think? Manually dealing with all of these, and what if I wanted patterns instead of just straight URLs? What if I had something like a shopping cart where I was looking at t-shirts and each one had an ID like 101, 102, 103? I wouldn't want to have to write a separate URL piece of logic for that. I might want something where I look at the end of the URL and use that as a variable and then decide which one to pull from the database based on that and other things. So routing gets complicated. We could do it ourselves, but it would be awfully nice if we had some kind of tool, a bunch of JavaScript code written for us that would do that. Well, we'll see that in a bit. But this is the basic idea of routing.